Hey guys, it's Mark back for another book review. I finished this one just the other day, and I really enjoyed this book. It's by an author named Ben Macintyre. If you're not familiar with Ben Macintyre, he's a fantastic author. He's written a ton of stuff. I'm going to actually show you some things that I've read of his in the past. Macintyre was born in 1963 in England, graduated with a Bachelor of History from Cambridge. I think his father was a professor at either Oxford or Cambridge, and was tragically killed in a car wreck when Ben was fairly young. He is a really good historian. The stuff he writes is very interesting. And this particular book, is called Prisoners of the Castle. Prisoners of the Castle. This is a book about, you can see on the cover here, this prison right here. It's called Colditz Prison. It was a POW camp during the Second World War, where the Nazis held Allied soldiers that they captured. During, of course, the early part of the war, the Americans weren't in it yet, so you had mainly French, Poles, Czechs, and British people there. And this was a camp that was particularly set aside for the most difficult prisoners that the Nazis had trouble with, so they moved them to this particular fort that was right in the city of Leipzig. It was right in the town, and so it was very enticing for the guys to try to get out. And a lot of the stories in the book are, of course, stories of escape attempts and people that actually were able to get out of the prison. During the entire course of the war, I think toward the end of the book, he says about 36 soldiers were able to get out and do what they called make a home run, which is get home. And what they normally did was escape through southern Germany and get into Switzerland. One of my favorite stories in the book was a aristocrat in the French army, I believe was a lieutenant colonel. He was able to escape. He got into Switzerland, and he actually left a note in the prison that said, hey, once you discover that I'm gone, I want you to send my clothes. The guy had very good taste, and actually when he was captured had quite a few nice suits and civilian clothes. He said, I'd like you to send my clothes to this particular hotel in Switzerland. And the Germans, I think, as a tip of the cap to him, were like, that's pretty audacious, and they actually sent the guy his clothes, which I thought was a pretty cool war story. The other thing that's really fascinating about this book, if you grew up at the time when I did, and I'm older obviously now, you watched Hogan's Heroes, and there was a lot of stuff in Hogan's Heroes that you kind of rolled your eyes at. When you read this book, the historical account of the Colditz Prison, you begin to realize that stuff's real. These guys did that stuff. There are stories where they actually had tunnels and underground bunkers that they had equipment in. They actually had a functioning radio that they used the entire time that they were able to put together. And they were able to listen to the BBC every night. They had war news that was up to date. It drove the commander of the Nazi prison camp nuts, because he was like, I know these guys know this stuff, but they could not find the radio. They would use a woman in town, just like in Hogan's Heroes. They had a German woman in town who was helping them. She was an assistant to a dentist. They would do things or complain about their teeth, get sent out of the prison. She would inform them stuff, and they would bring the information back in. They also used the Red Cross and mail to smuggle stuff in constantly. Because they were prisoners of war that were military, they were very organized. They set up groups. They had groups on food. They had groups on information. They had groups on training. They had groups on escape, mapping, engineering, all that kind of stuff. It was really impressive. One of the most fascinating things in the book is they literally built a glider in the prison attic without the Germans knowing, and would have tried to use it at some point, but the American army liberated them before they had an attempt to actually use it. But there are detailed drawings they have in the book of the glider. It was from an aeronautical engineer who had been captured, who was British. So this summer, my wife and I went to Colorado to get out of the Texas heat, and we got to the airport in Denver, and the line was super long. And one of the things I love about reading in history is perspective. And I remember standing there thinking, oh my gosh, this line is so long. This is going to take me probably 50 minutes to get through. And then you read this kind of stuff and you're like, hey, shut up. These guys were in prison for years. Sometimes, honestly, at this particular prison, they had a guy that was more part of the Wehrmacht, the German army, not necessarily the Nazis. He was fairly civilized to them. If you got sent to this prison, you weren't routinely beaten or tortured or that kind of thing, but still it was a horrible existence. The food was terrible, the nutrition was bad, you were often put in solitary confinement. So again, the kind of thing I like about reading books like this is, and reading in general, especially historical stuff, is it puts your life, a current modern day American life, in perspective. You know, to be grateful, not to complain. These guys went through horrific circumstances and were finally liberated in April of 45, I believe it was, right toward the very end of the war. It's a great book. I really enjoyed this book. The first half, there's a lot of stories about escape attempts. It's a little helter-skelter, and as you go along, you're kind of, I'm trying to see what the thread here. As he gets to the back half of the book, it really starts to concentrate. He really starts to get into more of a unified story of life in the prison, and it's really quite good, to where you can't stop turning pages at the end as the American army approaches, and tells stories, very sad stories, of Americans that were actually killed in the town as they started to approach the castle. That were pretty heartbreaking, guys that were so close and then ended up dying. There's stories of guys that lose their mind, go insane in the prison, guys that just break and try to escape and end up being killed by the guards as they try to get over the barbed wire. So if you've seen movies like Stalag 13 or The Great Escape, any of the, or the silly stuff like Hogan's Heroes, and you're familiar with that, you'll enjoy this book, because a lot of that stuff you'll be like, wow, this is like the real life unfunny version of what that was all about. Good book. Now, one last thing about McIntyre, he's written a ton of stuff, and I'll probably go back and do some. These are books of his I've read before. There's Agent Zigzag, Operation Mincemeat, The Spy and the Traitor, Spy Among Friends. This is really good. Rogue Heroes, great book. This is about the North African crew that became the SAS. Colonel Sterling, really good. Double Cross, and Agent Sonia. McIntyre's a prolific writer. I think this Prisoners of the Castle is about 325 pages or so. So pretty big book, but it reads really quickly, and it's really good. You'll enjoy it. So that's the review for this time. We'll see you again next time. Bye.